Hey folks, welcome to Black Gumbo Southern Gardening. How about some lessons that I've learned in my garden in 2019? Well, Happy New Year to you, and I hope that it's been a good 2019 for you. It's certainly been a great year for me. By way of review, I want to talk about some things that I've learned in my garden this year, and I'll also talk about some things looking ahead for 2020, which are already underway. So here are 5 things that I've learned this year. Number 1, I've learned a lot about soil structure and the importance of soil health this year. And I've learned that largely by trial and error. Over the years, I have always tried to practice some new method of gardening that I thought would help my soil in my raised beds. The first year I put my garden beds in, I put soil in there that I purchased from a dirt yard, local soil yard, and it was their garden mix. It had compost, it had mushroom compost, it had topsoil, things like that. But it wasn't very good quality. In fact, some of their compost was really questionable. And I found, building structure, compost wood, because you could tell if there was paint. I found bits of plastic and things like that. So I started off on the wrong foot. But I did grow a good garden that year, and I wanted to improve my soil. So I practiced that second year, tilling the soil and tilling in lots of fertility. Then I learned about no-till gardening and low-till gardening from people online and from reading Steve Solomon's book, Gardening When It Counts. I learned about all kinds of benefits of not tilling your soil, of letting nature till your soil. I've followed that up by trying to practice what's called no-till gardening. In my context, in my small little backyard garden, it's a raised bed, but it's essentially just a bordered in-ground bed now. But my soil is very healthy because over the years I've merely tried to restrict myself from tillage. I try not to turn the soil too much. Now, I'll go in and break it up every now and then and do the aeration of my soil, and that's because I don't have enough compost, I haven't in the past, to really lay down a big, thick layer of compost to plant in the Charles Dowding way. I just don't have that kind of compost production, so I have to go and break up my soil with a fork and just open up air channels. But since I've been doing that, or some version of that, for the most part, my soil has become very, very healthy. And the way I know it's healthy is everything grows in it really well. So yeah, I learned a lot about that by watching people like Charles Dowding, by watching people like David the Good talk about fertilization and composting, and by learning more about composting in 2019 than I've learned in all my life before. I read David the Good's book, Compost Everything. I've become quite a fan of David the Good, and we talked back and forth together about various things, and I compost just about anything that was once living. Meat, cheese, milk, smoothies, beans. I mean, all the stuff you're not supposed to put in your compost can go in your compost if you do it right. And so I've learned a lot about that. And as a result, I've got a pretty good volume of compost this year. Now, it's breaking down quite rapidly. It has reduced itself down quite a bit. I've already used about half of it. So yeah, I'm well on my way to good soil health using a no-till garden. I have a video, I'll link it right up there. Actually, I'll link it right up there, about my journey toward no-till gardening and the limitations I have. So yeah, I learned a lot this year about soil health, and I've chosen to try to practice no-till or low-till gardening as much as possible. It's not always going to be possible here, but as much as possible. That's my first lesson from 2019. The second lesson I've learned this year is perhaps a no-brainer to you, but for most gardeners, we have vast and grand plans, and we overdo things, or we overplant, or we overpurchase seed, and we don't have enough room or time to manage it all. And so this year, I have learned that limitations are real, and I've got to abide by limitations. I've got to realize that I am not a homesteader with acres and acres to farm on. I am a hobby gardener. I have a suburban backyard plot. I have 3 raised beds and a bunch of buckets, and that's all I've got. That means I can't grow 400 different kinds of tomatoes and also grow a pumpkin patch. I have to be more careful in the way I select my varieties. And, I often bite off far more than I can chew. I give away far more seedlings than I plant. I have far more varieties than I really ought to have. But that brings me joy to have a variety. So this year, moving forward, I will have lots and lots of varieties, but because of my limited space, I've chosen to enter the world of dwarf and micro-dwarf tomatoes. And so in 2020, you will see many dwarf and micro-dwarf varieties of tomatoes that don't take up a lot of space. I'll start about 10 seedlings of each. I'll select down to the most healthy plants, and I'll plant out 1 or 2 of each variety, and we'll go from there. Because I'm not trying to eat off my garden and in a sustenance manner. I'm not trying to feed my family. I'm trying to supplement, and I'm trying to enjoy food and good food. So yeah, fewer plants of more varieties rather than a lot of plants of a lot of varieties, and that will give me more space to do other things. And I'll also I got to come to grips with the reality of the situation. I don't have a farm. I have a little garden. Number 3, I wish I had learned sooner that year-round gardening in my area, Zone 9A, was not only doable, but was really easy. I have learned in 2019 that I can grow a spring garden, that I can grow a summer garden through the heat, and that I can grow a fall-winter garden through the coldest part of the year. Prior to this, I would grow a spring garden, and then I would just let some summer crops kind of struggle through the heat and see what I got out of it. And then I would either put a cover crop over my beds like clover, or I would just let them go to weed. This was before I was really, practicing sound gardening methods. And it was because I didn't do a fall garden, because to plant a fall garden meant I had to get out there and work in the heat of August and pull out crops. And well, I found that you can avoid all that kind of heavy work if you just have good garden maintenance. I don't have a lot of weeds to pull out now. I don't have a lot of tillage that I have to do. I don't have to go amend the soil in the middle of August, because one layer of compost in the spring will last me all through the year. So this year, sort of by accident, I have done a spring garden, a summer garden, and a fall-winter garden. And the fall-winter garden is thriving right now, and I'm enjoying it so much. So yeah, that's something that if you have the opportunity to garden year-round, you should take that opportunity, because now not only do I have to recognize my limitations, but by gardening year-round, my limitations expand a bit. I've got more growing time, and I can take advantage of that. Okay, the 4th lesson I learned in 2019 is probably the most important lesson I've learned of all, and it has to do with herbicides and contamination. I have learned that I can no longer trust outside resources when I bring them into my garden, especially when they have to do with hay, straw, or products that have hay and straw in them. What happened last year was that I brought in coastal Bermuda hay. I bought 4 bales of it. 4 bales would give me a nice thick 3 or 4 inch layer of mulch all through my garden. And because it's coastal Bermuda hay, it's a hybrid, it doesn't seed. So it's perfectly wonderful stuff to put on your garden as soil amendment and as mulch. It's great stuff if it's not treated with herbicide. This year my garden was treated with herbicide, which was probably an aminopyrrolate herbicide, which attacks broadleaf weeds, and it was probably sprayed on the pasture where that Bermuda grass was growing. And the problem with that is, yeah, it kills the weeds and you got a nice clean hay, but the problem with that is the herbicide is persistent. And the persistent herbicide means that it can go through all kinds of processes that otherwise would break down these molecules, like being digested in a cow's digestive tract and put out as manure. That persistent molecule is still in that manure and still potent to kill your plants. You can compost the stuff, and it survives the composting process and can still kill your plants. And so gardeners over the past few years have been really awakening to this threat of aminopyrrolate herbicides. And there's a there's another type of herbicide as well that's in this kind of family of killers. And they're produced by Dow AgroSciences, and I guess they could be used responsibly. Dow has acknowledged that this is a persistent problem, and puts in their little fine text, don't sell any product that was treated with this herbicide to anyone who's going to use it in a food growing context. Not to gardeners, not manures, not mulches, not hays, and you probably shouldn't even feed it to your animals if you ask me, but hey, what do I know? I'm just a gardener trying to make clean food. But this stuff came in and wrecked my garden. I put it on my tomatoes, and all my tomatoes had to be pulled up because they were deformed and malformed, and I don't want to eat tomatoes that have herbicide in them. So yeah, Charles Dowding experienced this in the UK. David the Good experienced this. It prompted him to write his book, Compost Everything. Other gardeners have begun identifying this, because the problem is you see it and you think that it's a virus, or you think your plant's being stressed out because the leaves curl up and they get all gnarly looking, and the edges of their leaves start looking like fractal art. It looks like you've just got a nutrition problem. But finally people are starting to wake up to the fact that, oh, I brought in that manure from the big box store. It must have been tainted. I've got a whole video on it. I've got several videos on it. But that's what I learned. What I learned from this terrible experience is I cannot trust outside resources for composting, for mulches, for manure. If I do bring in a bale of hay, I have to test it first. I have to do a bioassay. I have to plant something in it and see if it's tainted. If I bring in a bag of manure or compost from the store, I got to do the same thing. I got to plant some beans or tomatoes in there and see if they die. So yeah, I can't do the big box store stuff anymore. That's what I learned. That was awful. That also meant that I had to learn how to overcome that. That's my next point. All right, number 5. I have learned in 2019 that problems or challenges are learning opportunities and opportunities to innovate. When my tomatoes were destroyed by aminopyrrolate herbicide, it could have been a real downer, and I could have just thrown in the towel and quit and said, I'll just wait for the requisite year, 2 years, and until that stuff is out of the soil. But it was an opportunity for me not only to overcome, but learn new techniques. And so one of the things that I studied up on and learned about is doing bioremediation. And that was a technique that I learned about. I applied it to my garden. It worked, and I shared it with you. What I did was study the way that the herbicide that had tainted my garden actually kills and actually works. And I learned that it affects dicot plants. That's plants that when they sprout, they have 2 main leaves. But they don't affect monocots, which they just send up the single shoot. Monocot is like grass and hay and things that you grow to graze your animals on. Corn happens to be a monocot. It's a grass. So what I did was I planted my corn where my contamination had happened. I let that corn grow up, and all that herbicide in the soil was taken up by the corn and stored in the corn. And so since corn is not affected by it, it just sucks up what's in the soil. And I was able to chop that corn down and get rid of it, and that effectively took my contamination away. Again, have a video about it if you're interested in seeing how we conquered the contamination. So far, so good. We had victory, and I was able to learn something. I was able to learn some methods to overcome. I was able to plant some corn that grew beautifully. It was a beautiful decorative corn I was trying to grow. Now, a storm did come and blow it down. I didn't get to use any of it. However, that's what helped me to realize, wow, I can grow an entire summer crop as well as help my soil, overcome my problems, and teach others how to do the same. And so that limitation was actually, so that challenge turned out to actually be a real benefit to my garden this year. I was able to learn some things and just over. All right, what do we have looking forward to 2020? I'm going to be planting, like I said, micro tomatoes, micro dwarfs. I'm going to do some eggplant. I'm going to do some various kinds of various kinds of crops that I really enjoy. Some squash. I'm going to redo the pumpkin pits this year. I'm going to start them off on time, and hopefully we'll get some Seminole pumpkins. And yeah, it's going to be a good year of growing some good vegetables. So looking forward to 2020. It's been a wonderful fall. You can see behind me there, the brassicas are doing really well. I've been eating out of the garden, and I got some onions coming in, and we'll have onions this coming spring. And yeah, it's going to be a good year. Look at that, Meyer lemons. This tree is 5 years old, and after year 2, it has put on a crop like this every single year. So many lemons, we don't know what to do with them all. Happy New Year to you. Hey, Phoebe has a message. You're going to do fireworks tonight, or tomorrow night, New Year's Eve, and holidays. Man, enjoy them, but man, Phoebe wants you to cut off at a reasonable time. Poor dog's terrified of fireworks, aren't you? Excuse me. So, thanks a lot for joining us today on Black Gumbo Southern Gardening. It's been a really good year, and I'm so glad that so many of you have shared my garden with me. I look forward to a new year, new opportunities, new crops, new lessons, new videos, new subscribers. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Like us on Facebook and Instagram, and we'll see you next year. Bye-bye.